So I had this idea that I was looking for something, some mechanism for connecting everything in the world, and I didn't know what that might be. And then one scientist just told me as an aside, oh, you must go speak to Hal Puthoff. He has some crazy idea about this thing called the zero-point field. So I phoned Hal. I didn't get a chance to meet him until the following year when we both met in England. That was one of the interesting things about this research. I met people all over the world, and many times, because I live in London, we had to meet at a third country. Hal was an incredibly mild-mannered character. He reminds me of a Clark Kent, one of these people who is very phlegmatic on the exterior, and that posture, in a sense, conceals this amazing, boiling inner world of lateral thinking. He's just one of those classic explorer scientists who thinks about, well, what if, and uses what if to ask the most outrageous questions. And that's one of the interesting things and the fascinating things for me about doing this work is talking with frontier scientists who have to ask these outrageous questions all the time. What if stones fall from the sky? What if you can lift giant metal things and make them fly? That's what propels any kind of advancement, that ability and willingness to ask an outrageous question. And with Hal, the outrageous question really came about during the 70s when America had an oil crisis. His benefactor, Bill Church, had run out of gas and was so angry about it because he had run out of gas on one of those days when you couldn't get gas unless, your license plate had a certain kind of number on the back. So he was fuming, and he spoke to Hal and just said, well, what else could we do besides fossil fuel? We need to find an alternative. And that question set Hal off on a really interesting what-if exploration, which was just to say, okay, what else could we do besides fossil fuel? And he thought of all the usual suspects, things like solar power. And then what came to mind was a thing that physicists know about, but have more or less discarded or ignored. It's this thing called the zero-point field. And what it is the energy produced by an energy exchange between subatomic particles. All the subatomic particles in the world operate by passing energy back and forth, almost like an endless game of basketball. They send a basketball over to another particle, the other particle sends it back. And so it goes on between all the subatomic particles in all the things in all the world. So you can imagine how many basketballs are going back and forth. That energy exchange produces little virtual particles that just last for a blink of an eye. But that kind of back and forth energy exchange creates so much energy that if you were sitting a yard away from me, the energy between us would be so much, it'd be enough to boil all the oceans of the world. So that's power, and it occurs in empty space, or so-called empty space. To Hal's mind, this field, and it's a field is like a matrix. It's the mothership, a medium for things to go through. So Hal realized that if he could extract energy from this field, he would have what he called a cosmic free lunch. He'd be able to just have empty space power things. And he started thinking, well, this is not only a great way to power automobiles, but it's a wonderful way to power spaceships to far-off galaxies. Because at the moment, if we were to try to do that, we'd need a rocket as big as the sun to carry all the fossil fuel that would be required to take us that far. So Hal started really thinking about this and working on it. And he actually worked out mathematically, which is how physicists do things, the fact that if you factored in the zero-point field, you could explain all sorts of things that have bedeviled physicists for the longest time. Things like how inertia works or how gravity works. Those are big questions that physicists have never been able to provide a real proving of, a real explanation for. And suddenly, if you factored in the field, it all made sense. The field isn't anything that's mysterious to the ordinary physicist. They've known about it for years, ever since the development of quantum physics, but they've more or less subtracted it out. They figured because it was ever present, it didn't count. They do a thing called renormalizing it. By getting rid of the field, their equations start working. They don't have to go on to infinity. So Hal thought, well, hey, maybe the field is the whole point of the story. Maybe what they've been subtracting out is the whole important bit. So he started thinking about this, and then he also realized something almost as a sideline, because Hal is a frontier physicist, but he looks into questions of astrospace and things like that, but he's a very orthodox physicist. So these were just things he was contemplating in his more private moments. He kept thinking, well, there's a metaphysical implication here with the field, because the field as a mothership of all energy produced from quantum particles in the world, the field is almost like a repository of all information. Because the important thing to know about quantum particles or quantum waves, because a particle is also a wave, is that it's an encoder of information. When two waves bump into each other, they exchange information, so they take on the information of the other. So if you have that in a giant field, you have almost like a shadow of the universe. You've got all the information that's ever been. So Hal started thinking, well, gee, maybe you could manipulate this field. Maybe we could send certain information out to it. And there was also a bigger implication, which was if the field is connecting everything via their subatomic particles, then at the nethermost level of our being, we must be connected with everything else in the world. Hal also had some private thoughts about the field. In his private moments, he kept thinking to himself that the field is an interesting mechanism for explaining a number of things. First of all, if the field exists and everything is part of this field, it might be true that consciousness can manipulate this field and create certain ordered structures in it. It also might be the case that it would be a mechanism to explain a number of things. He thought a bit about cases of levitation that had no other explanation other than manipulating some force. He thought perhaps this is a bit like the Force in Star Wars. And he also thought about it being a mechanism for connecting everything together. Now, once I'd heard that, and I started talking to Hal and then talking to some of his other colleagues, people like Bernie Haish out in California, as they started talking, it was like a giant light bulb had gone on in me. I suddenly realized, now, to the layperson like me, to the non-physicist, this was the mechanism. This was the perfect explanation for how things like spiritual healing and homeopathy and acupuncture could possibly work. Here was the way that we would all be connected, that information from one set of thoughts could be sent to somebody else and have it affect them instantaneously. So I realized with Hal, I had found my mechanism. I had found a way to describe how this worked. And I then had to just see if everything else could fit together with this. One of the problems, though, having to do with quantum physics the way it is now cast, is that according to most orthodox physicists, quantum physics only applies to the non-living. Biological systems of any kind, any living systems, including us and plants and anything else like that, supposedly don't have quantum processes in them. So for my theory to work, it would have to mean that I'd have to find information and evidence that we and every other living thing are also a quantum process. So that became my